Welcome to a brand new season of Think Governance. In this series, we unpack King 5, a bold new standard for ethical leadership, accountability, and sustainable value creation in South Africa. Join us as we explore what this means for directors, business leaders, and governance professionals shaping the future.
So joining me today is Deon Rossouw, who's been a member of the King Committee for at least 10 years. Deon, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Parmi.
So I really wanted to start off with a discussion around Principle 2 in King 5, where there was a decision made to integrate ethics and corporate citizenship. What does this broader framing mean for boards?
It's a very unfortunate development that one see not only here in South Africa, but also on a global scale. That very often organizational ethics is focused on by one group of people inside the organization, while when it comes to corporate social responsibility or corporate citizenship, there's a totally different team and a different focus. And that is very unfortunate because your ethics has both the internal and the external dimension, and they should never be separated. And to some extent, I think the previous King reports, King 3 and 4 at least, also maintained that division by having separate principles for organizational ethics and then also for corporate citizenship. And I think this combination is a very fortunate one. And I hope it will have implications way beyond South Africa, that the rest of the world will also start integrating these two aspects, because we often see in other codes that they are also two separate concepts and also treated separately in terms of governance principles. So the other important thing that happened in King 5 by now bringing the two of them together and say the governing body should govern ethics so that there's both a internal organizational ethical culture and that the organization is a responsible corporate citizen, is that it's also linked now to specifically the Social and Ethics Committee. Because that was one of the best kept secrets in King 4, that the old Principle 2 dealing with organizational ethics and the Principle 3 dealing with corporate citizenship was really discussing the mandate and responsibilities of the Social and Ethics Committee. So what we get now is that the two are combined, and there's a clear indication that this should be handled by the Social and Ethics Committee of the board. And I think that just positions ethics much more centrally, even as before. And it also makes for an integrated approach, where we now have a strategy for not only our internal ethics, but also our external ethical impact, and that we have standards and that we have plans and that we oversee all of this. And that specifically will contribute to two of the major outcomes that we identified in King 5. The first one being ethical culture, and the other one being legitimacy. In other words, the organization being accepted as a valuable member of the society in which it operates.
So sounds like very deliberate and very necessary shift.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one that I think is welcomed. If we look at the response that we get through our stakeholder engagement and the commentary on the draft for public comment, there seems to be appreciation for this move, and it makes sense. And as I say, it was unfortunate that they lived on separate planets for so long.
So what are you seeing in the landscape with regards to ethics and expectations around ethics in organizations, both locally and globally? Are there changes? Are the expectations changing?
Definitely. If we go back to where we started with, and we go back to Milton Friedman, early 1970s, the business of business is business. Our only responsibility is to make profits for shareholders. I think we've moved way beyond that. But there are very important moves also that we see from King 4 to King 5 now. Because if you look at how corporations are being perceived in terms of their responsibility, we've moved away from Friedman which was only shareholder focused. We moved beyond CSR, which was sort of voluntary contributions that companies can make, or if they don't want, there was no obligation on them to do so, to this whole concept of seeing companies as members of the societies in which they operate and being co-responsible for the future and the well-being of those societies. So all of a sudden, it's not voluntary. It is a responsibility that you assume because we are aware that we operate in one integrated system. And if the system consisting of our social environment, our economic environment, but also the natural environment, if that collapses, we all go down. And therefore, there's now a very clear, not only expectation, almost obligation of what we expect from companies in terms, and other organizations, in terms of how they ensure that our whole planetary system is sustainable and that it will survive, so that not only us can benefit from that, but also our children and future generations.
Yeah. I think it's becoming clearer that society is more and more aware of ethics, and the expectation, the bar has raised, which is a great thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's no doubt that people out there expect this now from corporations. And that's why I say it's important that it's not like the early days of corporate social responsibility where it was voluntary, but that it's now weaved into your role that you play in society. And nobody is excused from that role, no organization.
So do you see any new ethical risks emerging in the current governance context, and how do you think King 5 addresses these?
There are always new risks arising, and of course we know about climate change and all the associated risks with that. AI, the introduction of AI has introduced a whole new range of risks. We also see within our own local context the presence and influence of crime syndicates now, not only in public service delivery, but also in the construction industry and elsewhere. And these risks are emerging at an enormous tempo. In other words, this whole VUCA world that we talk about. And I think the clever thing that King 5 did was to acknowledge all of these risks. In other words, it's not tone deaf to the fact that these risks are there, but it did not address them specifically and came up with governance solutions to these issues. Because if it would have done that, King 5 would have been outdated in a matter of months, if not days, after its publication. And that it rather opted for a very different approach, where it says, well, governing bodies of organizations need to constantly assess their risks in their economic environment, their social environment, their natural environment, the technological environment in which they operate, and then approve strategies. And based on the strategies, approve standards and approve plans for the execution of those strategies, and then monitor it very carefully. And also report in a mindful way about how they've handled these emerging risks. And I think that gives King 5 a considerably longer lifespan than it would have been if it focused on very specifically on issues of the day. Because we know that these issues are emerging at such a tempo. And if we look just at the field of information technology, how quickly that is emerging, and that everyone is admitting there are technologies on its way that we don't even grasp at this point, which might be a reality in a matter of months, if not years.
So, the number of things you are mentioning makes me sort of think that, whilst Principle 2 covers ethics in the organization, ethics permeates every other principle in the code as well.
Absolutely. And if we go back to our definition of corporate governance, it's about ethical and effective leadership. And that is what each of the other principles try to articulate, to say, what does ethical and effective leadership means when it comes to strategy, or when it comes to technology, or when it comes to remuneration. It's all about ethical and effective leadership. And in that sense, also that outcome of an ethical culture, which is one of the 4 main outcomes that King 5 articulated, is not only an outcome of principle 2. Yeah. It's a fact that each of the other principles should also contribute to that outcome of an ethical culture, of good performance, of prudent control, of legitimacy. So everything is interlinked.
So, a question that I think is very relevant in South Africa is, how do boards move from a compliance-based ethics to more values-driven ethics and governance? We see more and more organizations doing things to tick boxes rather than doing things for the right reasons. Yeah. What are your views on that?
It's an incredibly important move, because for too long there was a belief that if you want to get an ethical organization, you need to come hard down on unethical behavior. In other words, there's almost a belief that you get what you want by focusing on what you don't want. Yeah. And the whole emphasis on value-driven governance, I think, is a recognition that you get what you want by focusing on what you do want. In other words, you look, as always, you start with your purpose. Why are we here? What is the promise that we can deliver to our stakeholders? And then you ask yourself, well, if this is our purpose and our promise that we can deliver, what values do we need? But then it's really about inculcating those values inside people. And the one thing that we've learned over time is that strong compliance-based approaches becomes counterproductive over time. Yeah. They actually make people less responsible than they were before. And that is why we need to move away from fear-based compliance approaches, where that famous saying of zero tolerance is our only approach to how we deal with ethical issues. But that it's rather a case that we want people to appropriate the values of the organization. And that starts right at the top. It starts in the boardroom. It starts with the governing body signing off on the value system of the organization, but then monitoring it very carefully and ensuring that people do own these values, and ultimately look at whether it contributes to our outcomes of, amongst other things, the ethical culture and legitimacy and performance and control and all of that.
So a lot of what you're saying is making me think around the way King 5, but also King 4 and previous codes were drafted around an outcomes-based with flexibility, etc., not necessarily a compliance rules-based approach, which was very deliberate. Although you'll see some criticism some days where people will say King 4 is light, it should be more rules-based and enforce certain things. So what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, and it's actually, if we go back in the entire King report tradition, right to King 1 even, there was always this desire to avoid ticking boxes. And the aspiration was always mindful compliance. In other words, take this and apply it in your context. And I think this is just a continuation of that tradition. And I think there are very good grounds for sticking to this approach by saying what we present in the King reports is best practice recommendations. If you want ethical and effective leadership, if you want an ethical culture, good performance, effective control in your organization, and legitimacy, you should embrace these. Not because the law forces you to do so, but because if you do this, you will enhance the performance, the success, and the sustainability of your organization. And when people embrace this voluntary, they will go much further than when they simply do something to tick a box and then stop thinking. We really want that mindful application. And I believe King 5 will help companies if they accept it in that spirit.
So that leads so nicely into my last question, which is, as a member of the advisory group, having been involved in the detail of the work that was done, what is your hope for King 5?
My hope for King 5 is that it will do exactly what corporate governance is all about. Ethical and effective leadership, assisting organizations to fulfill the purpose. And by doing that, being responsible citizens of the broader context, so that we don't only build better organizations, but also a context that is enhancing not only for a specific organization, but for everyone who live in that system.
Thank you so much, Deon. As always, amazing learnings from your years of involvement, not only on the King Committee, but in the ethics space in general. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Parmi. It was a pleasure.
And thank you so much for listening. I'm sure you've taken lots of learnings from Deon, as have I. Thank you.